Welcome back to another great, and I'm saying that in advance, great shiur from Rabbi Pinchas Winston, which is entitled When the Call Goes Out. Welcome, Rabbi Winston. You should go to his website, and his website is called 36.org, and there you will be able to see a list of his shiurim, his books, and all the different things. Oh, wonderful. Look behind him. You have the 36.org. I don't have to put it up anymore. It's all there. We also want to encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Israel Torah, and make sure while you're there to subscribe and press on notifications so you will receive all of these great live webinars as they come out. And also, this is sponsored by the Bring Them Home project. So bringthemhome.org.il is our website. We are co-sponsored by Israel 365. And we look forward to hearing another great lecture. Thank you so much, Rabbi Winston. Take it over.
Thanks. Maybe even a bit controversial. We'll see how people respond to the material. This week's parsha is Parshas Kisisa. It's a very seminal parsha. Well, we say that every parsha is seminal in its own right, but one of the most important events, historic events that we know about, that is in this week's parsha, which is, of course, the Egel Zahav, the golden calf, the story, the episode of the golden calf. I'm not going to go through the whole story right now. You can look it up yourself, but just very simply, it was towards the end of the first 40 days that Moshe was on Mount Sinai, and he was on time, but some people, perceived it as if he was a little bit late, just a little bit late, and as a result of that, the mixed multitude that happened to be with the Jewish people in the desert at that time, they went out of Egypt with the Jewish people, and they were rabble-rousers to a large degree, and they instigated the building of the golden calf. There was some black magic involved, and eventually this calf came out, but it didn't last too long, because when Moshe came down from the top of the mountain, he saw what was going on. He broke the tablets, and he ground and burned the golden calf to dust. And you see the story inside there, but it's a symbol, basically, of so much that goes wrong in history, not just our own personal life, but history in general, because the golden calf is symbolic of a specific attitude towards life that has to be understood and has to be appreciated, not just by the Jewish people, but the nations of the world as well, but specifically by the Jewish people, because it all comes down to one very short line that is very important from a historical perspective, and certainly now, because we believe we're at the end of days. We very close to the end. It's the year 5781. History is only supposed to last 6,000 years. In that 6,000 years, we have the history that we're used to, but there's also going to be a messianic era, which is going to be followed by a period called the resurrection of the dead, Techis Mesim history, which means that there has to be redemption well before that takes place, and it seems, based upon certain sources and events, that we are very, 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 very close to the end. Hard to believe, very hard to believe. I mean, even for a believing Jew, it's hard to believe, because after thousands of years of predictions and waiting and anticipating and this, and we thought that was going to be that, and here we are, we're still looking for it and waiting for it, and is it ever going to come? But we believe. That's one of the 13 principles of faith, that we have to believe in this idea, we have to work towards it, and anticipate it. There's actually a mitzvah to anticipate the redemption, and therefore we have to learn whatever we can to help us do that, to prepare us for what's coming up, because everything in life is about preparation. If you're not ready for something, it catches you by surprise. You just miss opportunities, and sometimes it can be even deadly, if not physically, then spiritually. And it's been the story of the Jewish people for thousands of years now. Anyhow, the part that's controversial is not that part, but we're going to revisit something. It's a little bit painful for those who were personally affected by it, and even those who were not personally affected by it. But I just want to point out the reason we're doing this was not to open up an old wound or pour salt on one that never healed, but because there's a message in there that has to be extracted. And if anything, by not learning that message, we render what took place to become even more meaningless in the end. tragic and meaningless. By learning the lesson, by taking out of it what we have to take out of it, then it makes the event more eternal, more important, more meaningful, and more instructive in terms of how we ourselves should behave at this stage of history. When Moshe finally came down from the top of the mountain and saw the golden calf, and he broke the tablets, and eventually, they had to kill the perpetrators. So the Torah mentions that about 3,000 people died altogether. In the aftermath of what took place, about 3,000 people. That's exactly how many, but about 3,000 people. And one might think to themselves, well, what's the big deal? About 3,000, not more, not less, but around that number. But the Torah is pretty exact normally when it comes to the counting of the Jews, especially after events where Jews lie. Their lives are lost. So then the Torah actually counts everybody at the beginning of the Parsha. We have a census. This is the Parsha that we have the first real official census of the Jewish people. We learned laws that you can't count Jews 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but that they give a half shekel, and then we took the tally of all the half shekels and divided by 2, and we knew in the end, because all the shekels add up together, but just count the coins, and we knew what the number was because we were very exact. The Torah gives exact numbers of each tribe and the total number of Jewish people. What's this? About 3,000 people. Well, where does this number come from? So it might not have meant too much to many people, but at a certain point in time, when it became clear after World War II, maybe even before that, but mostly after World War II and much even later, so let's say this, the 80s and 90s, there's a concept called the Torah codes. Now, people might roll their eyes and go, well, I've heard about that, seen that before, and it can happen in any book, and who says that they're really real and it really built into it? Yeah, I know, I've heard all that, and I actually worked with some mathematicians on codes, and it's pretty spectacular, just that people can't really appreciate how spectacular it is. And I agree that not everyone is so meaningful, and you can't really prove anything from them because we have Torah, we have mitzvahs, we have tradition that tells us what to do. But when they show up and they do, then there might be something to learn. There might be some significant, especially when you consider the mathematical odds of combinations of words, show up in the same place, and the divine providence involved in the location that they actually show up. So when it was popular to do so, I don't know about today so much, but when it was popular to do so, was really around the time that the Twin Towers were attacked by the terrorists and destroyed completely. That was I think the middle of that Tekufa, that time period. And the first thing that people did when they heard about the attack, assuming it's a major attack, it's not a random thing. Nothing is random in life. Nothing. Even the smallest thing is not random, but so much more so if it's a huge, life-altering, history-altering event like the attack on the World Trade Center. So they're looking for the Torah codes, and they actually found a couple of things, but they found one really significant. Now, the people who found it may not have noticed a lot of the significance because that's not their job so much, but they found important key phrases. What they basically would do is look at the newspapers and see what are the main phrases, the main expressions that are being used by the media and people to describe this event. It doesn't have to be biblical terms. It could just be, this is what they call it. This is what the attack is called. This is what went on. This is the numbers being thrown around. And because those are the common denominators in all the perspective of the entire situation, they go looking for either the transliterations or the Hebrew words of those type of ideas. And they found very significant code. You can see it online. You can just type in, Twin Tower code or something like that, and you see the actual code online. And it turned out that it happened to show up literally in the Parsha about the golden calf, in this week's Parsha. That's where they found it, including terms like ground zero and various different things like that. And that made anybody who believes in the codes go, wow, that's wow, and even people who had difficulty believing the codes had to think, well, that is interesting at the very least. But of course, people don't want to believe necessarily that what happened is from God. They'd rather believe it's a random event, because then if it's from God, it might be a punishment. And what's that punishment? What does it mean? So let's just leave it in the realm of randomness, so we can just simply say it happened to innocent people in an innocent way. But that's not the way the Torah works. That's not what the Torah. And we're not judging anybody. That's the most important point to make at the beginning. Whoever died, it's God's cheshbon. The same way, if we talk about the Holocaust, and the 6 million people who died, there's no way that anyone is going to be able to say he died because of this reason, or she died because of that reason. These babies died because of this reason. We don't know. We have no idea. These are big question marks that maybe not will get answered later on when God reveals to us what was going on in history at a time that we no longer have to worry about knowing that level of truth, because there'll be no free will left at that point in time. And that's really God's department, judging people, judging souls, deciding, the Beis Din have an obligation in certain circumstances to judge people, but they're not really judging people as much as they're judging the actions that they did. What the person's soul is responsible for, what the actual person, did from God's perspective, only God can know that. So this is by no means in any way a judgment or even a pointing of a finger in any way at the people who actually died. We're not interested in that right at this moment in time. That was a tragedy. That's something we mourn. We're interested only in the things that come out of it, the actual technical details, because of what they might possibly mean. So when a Torah code showed up, and right in the section talking about the golden calf, where it says almost 3,000 people died, though where it's exact about the number of people involved, affected by it, it turns out that the attack itself killed altogether in the end, they weren't exactly sure, 2,977 people. Now that alone is not, it's not a big deal. I mean, in terms of, the number's a big deal, but not in terms of that number versus this number. That does. We're going to compile information. You go into a court of law and you want to defend yourself or defend somebody, and you present pieces of evidence, and the jury has to decide based upon the evidence, is the person innocent, is the person guilty? And the truth is it was completely obvious. You don't need a jury anymore, or it doesn't require much evidence, because the evidence is so pointing in favor that this person is guilty or innocent for that matter. But if it's not clear, there's a doubt involved, a reasonable doubt. So evidence has to be presented, and the jury gets to see it all, to hear about it, and then they go and they deliberate, and they come back with a decision based upon the evidence that, if all these things took place and all that information is true, it would seem to indicate this person is either innocent or guilty in the end. And we're doing the same thing. We're just taking a bunch of pieces of evidence, information that we do know is true, and compiling it, and then seeing what we might learn out of it for the future, to be able to avoid such catastrophes. So that's just one piece of information, one piece of evidence, if you will, that it's interesting that the Torah itself would approximate the number that ends up being very, very close, because I'm not even so sure they know exactly number in the end, because some people completely disintegrated. It was mind-boggling, how people died, in such a situation like that. So that's the number they came up with, but it overlaps, and the Torah code itself falls in this parsha dealing with that. The number, that's just one piece of information. Then we have the amount of terrorists that were involved in the attack. Apparently, I know that information has changed. I know that there's been updates and all that. I know there's been controversy. I know there's been conspiracy theories, etc., etc. But last I knew, that there were supposed to have been 20 terrorists. One, for some reason, didn't make it. I forget the reason why. Even though I read one report that most of the people who are named as the terrorists, some of them weren't even in the country at the time, but pushing all that aside for the time being, because in the end, it doesn't really make a difference. Believe it or not, it doesn't make a difference. What makes a difference is the perception. God works with our assumptions and our perceptions. If we perceive 19 terrorists, whatever reason, if that's what comes out, and that's the conclusion, even if it's a lie, but that's the number that's floated into the world, and that's what we walk away with. That's what God wants. That's the reality. However he comes to get us to think about something is his business. But if that's what we end up with, that's the hashgacha, that's the divine providence. There's lots of times in life things don't end up being we thought they were, but at the moment we did, because we did that, and that's what had to happen. Oh, if I had known that, I wouldn't have done that. But that's why God didn't tell you that, because he wanted you to do that. So therefore, it could be a false perception, but that's the way God works. He works with our assumptions and perceptions to give us that perception that we can come to certain conclusions. He wants it to come to at that time, even revise them later on. So the fact that they said there were 19 terrorists, not 20 they're supposed to be, that's already a fishy situation. There should have been 20. 20 signed up for the job or appointed, whatever, right? And only 19 made it. One didn't. Okay, it's not such an unusual thing that one guy can't make it or check it out in the end and change his mind. But that's what happened. 19 terrorists, showed up. At the same time, they're talking about this, right? One of the most, I can't use the word spectacular, but one of the most curious things, my background happens to be the architecture. I was actually in university at the time, and we were taken on a field trip. I was in Ontario in Canada, and we went down to New York to look at a lot of the architecture we'd been studying in school, and one of which was the Twin Towers. We actually didn't study that, but it was built, and it was a spectacular building with new engineering and ingenuity. And we're taking on a tour of that building, right to the top, right to the roof. And the person who was giving us, he was a guide for the building, was telling us the specs of how it was built and all that. And one of the things he emphasized completely over and over again, it's like literally, it was like, decades later, this rang in my head the moment I saw this attack that was going on, because it was so emphasized that because of other buildings that had been hit by airplanes, these buildings were constructed with a unique construction that a plane could fly into the side of it and not affect the lower floors. That's the way it was built. I mean, there are videos made by engineers and chemists who have made the same point and shown how there's no way that those planes could ever have brought those towers down. But that's not what interests me right now. The point is they did. And the fact that they did is divine providence. And that's what happened. And they pancaked all the way down. No way it should have happened. There was never enough heat, but they did. Whatever. You can argue why and how the entire time and never know the truth. But one thing we know for sure, just look at the video. Anyone's in New York, I went to see I was there in New York shortly after, and I saw firsthand what the site looked like after. I even saw store windows with dirt and soot piled like almost to the roof. It just came through the air into the cracks, and that's what happened. It shouldn't have, but it did. It should have, maybe a few floors possibly burned, started on fire before they were able to put it out. And if it's going to fall over, it falls over to the side. None of this implosion business stuff. That stuff doesn't make sense given what actually took place and all the laws of pyrotechnics, whatever. But it did. And the report said that from the time the first plane hit the first building to the second plane hit the second building, and it came down, altogether was 102 minutes. That's what it said. Now, 102 minutes, was someone like actually timing. There might have been a way to time it exactly, but let's face it. When it comes to minutes in the course of hours, it's very easy to be off by a minute. And who's going to complain? Who's going to say anything? 102, 103, even 106. It's within that. We know approximately within the realm of time what that is. But between 102 minutes and 103 minutes, there's no big deal. It's easy. It's very possible. It's very possible for the situation to occur, where that it could take a lot longer or take a lot less time. But the very fact that it happened in that period of time, is significant, because that's divine providence too. It's not random. God decides exactly when something's going to be destroyed and fall to the ground, how long it will take. And they pancaked all the way down. The speed of gravity. Gravity has pulled the whole thing down. Should it have happened? Impossible? It did. Okay, whatever. Now, what's amazing is that it turns out that if you look at the word Egel Zahav, which is Hebrew for the golden calf. This is where it's all being found in terms of the Torah codes. And again, I enjoy the Torah codes. There's no question about it. I find them very fascinating because of all the divine providence involved. But I haven't seen them for years, and I'm not necessarily advocating that. I'm just pointing out this information because of the punchline that I'm leading towards. This is just important to understand that we're going to build. We're building, okay? Hopefully we have time to finish it. But that's the idea. Egel Zahav is a golden calf. The gematria of the word Egel is 103, and the gematria of the word Hazav is 19. What are the odds? What's the connection? I don't know. Just pointing out the information, which is becoming a little bit more mysterious because of the fact that you do have these Torah codes taking place right in the middle of the golden calf episode and story. And you have this working out. Fine. Okay. Point number 2. Point number 3. Now, what's interesting is the Twin Towers, right, are in the shape of 11. If you see them from the coastline, you're going to stand back and the other side of the Hudson River, I guess. That's, wherever you, that's the body of water, I believe, there, a little further away. You will see that there are 11. The only buildings like that in New York, I believe, that height, that literally, it's like as if the number 11 is a gateway to the city. This is the gateway to the financial market of downtown New York, really of America, for that matter. This is Wall Street, the whole area downtown, and that's Esav's world. Esav represents the idea of Olam Hazeh, this world, and financial prowess is one of the things that that defined Esav as an individual. And America and Europe and even Russia, all these countries are descendants of Esav and represent that perspective. So in a sense, that those buildings are almost a trophy of the accomplishment that Esav and his descendants have been able to carry out over the course of thousands of years, and most recently a couple hundred years of time. That's what it is. Is there anything evil in that? No, nothing per se. No, on the contrary, everything's legitimate. If people aren't cheating one another, the business is running that should be running. It's fair and it's just and it's legal and all that. 100% kosher. So why should the towers be affected? Good question. Good question. But leave the whys for the time being. We're just pointing out that's the reality. Why is that so significant? That's significant because the number 11 is associated with Esav. How do we see that? So if you look in Parshas V'Yishlach, at the end of the Parsha, it mentions that Esav had 11 chiefs. There are 11 chiefs, tribes of Esav, broken into 11 different groups and tribes. And the number 11, according to Kabbalah, comes from the 11 klipos, or 11 lights. At the time of creation, they were not yet rectified. They weren't rectified. Because they weren't rectified, Esav was able to exist and do what he did in history and all the bad that's taking place. Klipos are impure realities that really cause people to sin. And that's associated with Esav because the number 11 has corresponds to these lights that were unrectified, because that's what man's job was supposed to be. Our job, if Adam HaRishon had only not eaten the tree of knowledge of good and evil, had waited till Shabbos, had prayed until that time and done what we call Yechudim in Kabbalah, then he would have rectified these 11 lights. The Messianic era would have begun a few hours later. He didn't do that. On the contrary, he reversed a lot of the rectification of creation, and that plunged history into, outside the Garden of Eden, into exile, and these 11 had to be fixed up. So, you have this 11, right? Now, the truth is, there's 2 11s, and they're very prominent. For those who maybe recall the Hanukkah Shia, I don't remember back when, what we discussed at that time, but there's something called the equation of life. From a Torah, more Kabbalistic perspective. I'll just say it briefly. I have a book called The Equation of Life. Everything I'm going over right now, more or less, is in that book. You want the detailed explanation? Buy the book. But it just, as a very, an overview of the concept, the equation of life is very simple. 25 plus 11 equals 36, and 25 subtract 11 equals 14. What do these numbers mean? 25 represents the light of God, but while it's hidden in creation. So you can look at the world and, where is the hand of God? People are atheists today. They're agnostics. How is that possible? If the whole world exists because of God and actually inside God is a part of God, how is it possible for people to deny the reality of God? And even for religious people who accept the reality of God to act as if he's not there. Because God hides his light. It's a known thing. Hester Putney. Our job is to reveal that light. When we saw that we light 36 candles of Hanukkah time, 36 tractates in the Babylonian Talmud, 36 righteous people in every generation, and there's a bunch of 36s all over the place because that number represents when the light's been revealed. So the number 25 is the light when it's been hidden, and 36 means the light's been revealed. So every time the number 36 shows up in the Torah or in life, now that means that light's been extracted from creation and revealed. So the Shema has 25 letters to tell us that our job as the Jewish people is to reveal that light. And then we do, then the world becomes rectified, and Mashiach comes. And the world is the way it's supposed to be. That's the goal. How do you do that? Well, it's simple. Just add 11. 25 plus 11 equals 36. Okay, but now mathematically that's true, but philosophically, what does that mean? So 11 corresponds to something that Kabbalah calls das, because it's kind of the 11th sphere, but that's a whole series of discussions on their own. It's a certain type of knowledge, Torah knowledge. Torah gives us the capacity to be able to look at the world, see God in it, and extract it. So if you're doing a mitzvah, you're eating food for the right reasons, you're learning Torah, you're doing anything that by definition increases your awareness of God and the awareness of God in the eyes of others, that's the number 11. 11, that's what's doing it. That knowledge, that perspective we call das Elokim, godly knowledge. Negative das, right? Because it was a tree of knowledge of good and evil. So there's positive das and there's negative knowledge, right? So the positive 11 obviously corresponds to Yaakov and his way of looking at reality. And he learned Torah. And he was a man of God, a man of truth. And everything he did was to reveal God in the world. His twin brother, Esav, right, did the opposite. He hung on and clung to negative dust. So if you take that light and you add negative dust, negative 11, you get 14. What's the 14? So Kabbalah explains. In the beginning, when God made the world, he stopped the light 14 levels from the bottom so that man could bring it down the bottom, the final 14 levels. So 14 represents that spiritual void in creation. So A says, well, look at the world today. Look at the atheism and agnosticism. And just take it as a matter of fact, right? We take it as just that's the way mankind is. People believe and people don't believe. There's times they do. No, you don't understand. It's the most impossible thing. The only reason why there's so much doubt, and it doesn't make a difference if you're a professor in a university or Einstein, if you're missing this positive 11 dust, and you're only using Ace's dust, you'll miss the point of life altogether. You can figure out E equals MC squared, no problem. And all the other, theorem, and quarks and quantum, you can do all that stuff. Okay, that's Ace's world. But to be able to see God in it all, that's Yaakov's world. Twin brothers. Now, what makes it, really, really, even more fascinating, you start to compile the information, is that the attack took place also on the 11th day, and I think one of the flights was flight 11 too, they point that out, just compiling the information, just put on the table, is that it took place the year after Y2K. Oh, Y2K. Why was Y2K? Y2K, Y stands for year, 2 is a 2, and the K is 1,000 represents 1,000, so it's year 2000, because when they made the computers, they didn't know how to put in the year 2000, and they were concerned that there'd be a major, massive computer failure that could leave the world totally vulnerable, and it cost us $64 billion to fix. And in the end, not much really happened other than the fact it cost us $64 billion to fix. And we went on, right? But the year before that, now, from a Western, non-Jewish perspective, that's just the way there's this and there's that and there's that. There's Y2K. And there's the Twin Towers and all that. But from a Torah perspective, everything follows a set order, especially since the year 2000, which was the year of Y2K, also called the Millennium Bug, right? Was 5760 in the Jewish calendar, and the Vilna Gaon said that would be a year of redemption. if not complete redemption, some kind of partial redemption, something to do with redemption, for kabbalistic reasons. And there's a mathematical, formula to work it. But that's what he said, predicted this going back to the end of the 1700s, long before there was Twin Towers and things like that. So it's a significant year. We knew that in advance. We had no idea what was going to happen next, but we knew that, and people anticipated. And it's amazing, by the way, because you look at the newspapers for that year, until the year 1999, right? The New York Times and the Washington Post and all these, and didn't talk about Torah that much, or Armageddon, or Messiah. These are terms were, relegated to extremists, and I know the what do you call it? Newspapers that were fringe newspapers. Who talks about things like that? This is a serious world. But that year and the year 2000, these things came up all the time. There was a shift in mentality, a paradigm shift at that time. But Y2K, and it was interesting because someone was floating around. They came up with this idea, and when I saw it, kind of blew my mind because I don't know if I even thought about this before I saw it. But they pointed out the fact that Y2K in Hebrew would be written Yud Beis Kuf, Yud Beis Kuf, which spells the word Yabok. Now Yabok, what's Yabok? What does that word Yabok mean? Right? So if you know your Chumash, you know that Yabok is a northern tributary of the Jordan River. And what made that river significant was the fact that this is the river that Yaakov crosses on the way back home after being by Lavan's house for 20 years. This is now his 36th year altogether, coming home. And he's going to be 36 years altogether. And he's coming home, and that's where he confronts the Sar Shel Esav, the angel of Esav, at this river. And a very significant thing happens at that time. Very significant, hugely significant. And what's that? He fights with the angel the entire night, which the Medrash says corresponds to exile. This is a historic battle. This is a symbolic battle taking place. It says that they fought the entire night, because that night corresponds to exile. And when the sun rises the next morning, that corresponds to redemption. So this is a redemption event taking place and alluding to so many different things that the Medrash talks about. So that's significant. By the Yabok River. And what happens is after he defeats the angel says, I got to go. Because it's my turn to praise God in heaven, and I don't want to miss my opportunity. I've been waiting since creation to do this, and now it's my turn. I got to get up there, and he says, "Well, bless me." And when he goes to bless him, he doesn't say you should be successful in business. He doesn't say you should raise a nice family. He says, "What's your name?" He says, "My name is Yaakov." And he says, "Okay, no longer is your name Yaakov, but your name is Yisrael, because you fought with angels and men, and you prevailed." That's what the pasuk says. And then the angel takes off, and Yaakov goes meets Esav, and eventually after Shem, God confirms the name change, but his name is changed. And it's a historic name change, very, very historic name change. And where does it take place? By the Yabok River. So the Yabok River is a symbol of the separation, because Yaakov is the twin brother of Esav. Yaakov can shop until he drops, just like Esav can pray. Like Yaakov can be just like Esav too. We see that. Look at the Jewish people who can assimilate and live just like them. And it's called Pesach because Hashem is posech over the houses of the Jews because they're living amongst the Gentiles. We assimilate. It's all over the world. It's been doing it for thousands of years. So when he becomes a Yisrael, he distinguishes himself. He stops being the twin, and now is a hybrid. Is a whole different creation. And the Yabok is a symbol of this. And what really, really blew me away was when I happened to be going through Shara Gilgulim, which is the Arizal's monumental work on the concept of reincarnation and personal rectification. And in chapter 18, he happens to mention there that Yabok is more than that. It fits in perfectly, but it's a lot more than that. Now, what is it? He says there are three names of God. The first one is spelled Aleph Daled Nun Yud, was the one we pronounce the way it's written. The second one is Yud Ke Vav Ke, the Tetragrammaton, which we don't pronounce the way it's written. And the third one is Aleph Hey Yud Hey, which we can, but we don't always have use for it. That's what God in Parsha Shmo says to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe says, "Okay, I'll go to the Jewish people. Whose name should I tell my descent?" So God says, Ekya Asher Ekya. God mentions the name right there and then shortens it just to Ekya on a first name basis. And that's the third name. And if you add up the gematria of each of these names, they equal the word Yabuk. Oh, okay, fine. But what's the significance? So he says the significance is that when a person learns Torah, he says, this is the Rizal speaking, so it's pretty reliable. He says when a person learns Torah, it does mitzvahs primarily, just on a very simple basis, but he does it, for the right reasons. He gains his soul, the level of nefesh, the lowest level of soul, gains access to the name Aleph Daled Nun Yud. You get that light, that holiness from that level. But now, the person then learns the oral law, and again for the right reasons, right? He advances his learning and goes a little higher up, so he gains access to the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. And if a person goes even further, he says, by learning Kabbalah, then he gets access to the level of Shama, which is of Aleph Hey Yud Hey, and he becomes what the Torah calls an Adam Shalim, a completed individual, which is tied to Yaakov Avinu because he looked like Adam Marisha, but he's the perfected Adam Marisha. So your book itself represents the shleimus, the completion. In fact, the Torah says after he fights with the angel of Esav and he goes to Shechem, the Torah makes unusual comment that Rashi's forced to say something. It says he arrived at Shechem Shalem. All right, whatever. What's that supposed to mean? So Rashi says he was complete in his wound was healed, and his Torah was okay, and his mammon, his money, was intact. That's what Rashi says to Shalem. But we see from this that your book means a lot more. So the very fact that you have an event taking place, the buildings that look like the number 11, that takes place on the 11th day, that they're called the Twin Towers, and the Jewish history is all about the separation of these two twins, meaning that Yaakov goes ahead and becomes a Yisrael and separates himself out, at least some of Yaakov. And the very fact that the Medrash even goes so far as to say that Yaakov is compared to a flame, Yosef compared to fire, and Esav is compared to straw. And Yosef is the flame that goes out from Yaakov and burns up Esav. There's a famous Medrash that Rashi brings down in Parshat Vayeshev and compares it to this wagon load of straw, of flax coming to town. And these people are watching it happen, take place. And one guy turns to the next guy and says, wow, it's a lot of flax. Where did I put it all? And he says, one spark from an anvil, the smithy's anvil, and the whole thing goes up in flames like that. Boom, 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 boom. And so Rashi says, what's the analogy, the nimshal? He says basically that the nimshal is that Yaakov Avinu looked in the previous parsha and saw all these chiefs of Esav, this massive, mighty army of Esavians who are going to rule the world, billions of them. And Yaakov is a small, tiny little nation. How are we possibly going to be able to deal with the war of Gog and Magog and all of our enemies? So Rashi brings this mashal. One spark, the whole thing goes up just like that. Just like that. And when Moshe takes the golden calf, what does he do? He grinds it down, he burns it till there's just ashes in the end. And a building, buildings that should never have come. I mean, look at the pictures. I mean, it's just completely impossible to fathom how so much metal and steel and rivets and bolts and drywall and furniture and office equipment and all of it, of 104 floors of it, and two buildings completely decimated, unfathomable, and you have all these connections taking place, right? There are other points, okay? There are other points. Like I said, you can read in the book, and we're running out of time, and I want to get to the punchline, which is really the most important part. At the end of the day, right, whatever took place, meaning by the golden calf. The Erev Rav got involved. There were perpetrators. There were Jews that also got involved, but 3,000 people altogether. Now the rest were guilty because it didn't stop it from taking place. But in the middle of all of this, something very, very significant takes place. And what is that? So Moshe comes down. He realized, God wants justice. He wants the situation cleaned up. So Moshe calls out and says, "Mi Hashem Elai." Whoever is for God, come to me. And the entire tribe of Levi came to him, and they did what had to be done to purge the camp of the sin of the golden calf. And that becomes a symbol of devotion to God and loyalty. We even praise Levi later on in Parshas Zos HaBrocha because of his willingness to put his personal interests aside to do what had to be done on behalf of God. My Rosh Hashiva asked the question why they didn't do it before Moshe came down, but that's a different story. And there's a very famous story, much further in history, about Rav Shimon Schwab, a big, gadol, a rabbi who, began a community back in America and built it up, and it's well known. And he was a young boy. I don't think he was married yet at the time. And he went to the Chafetz Chaim in Rajin before he left to get a brocha. He was the gadol Lador. He wanted a brocha. He's going to a place called the Midbar. America was called the Midbar at that time because it's so lacking in spirituality and Torah. So it was called the Midbar. An interesting story about that one too. And he went to the Chafetz Chaim, spent Shabbos with him, and went to get a brocha. So it's like the Yaakov says, "Give me a brocha. What's your name? Where's the brocha?" That's in that, right? So what's the brocha that the Chafetz Chaim gives to Rav Shimon Schwab? He says the following, the famous story. You do it, right? He says to him, "Why aren't you Cohen? Why aren't you a Cohen?" My father wasn't a Cohen, because the Cohen has to go to the father, right? So Chafetz Chaim says, "Why wasn't he a Cohen?" Because his father wasn't a Cohen. I mean, it's obvious, but this is the Chafetz Chaim. It's the Chafetz Chaim. Yeah. So he says, and why wasn't he a Cohen? And now Rav Shimon Schwab is picked up. He knows that he's not asking him about family lineage right now. He's asking something far more profound to do with his request for a bracha. And he says, I don't know. I don't know what the Rav wants to hear. He says he's not a Cohen because back at Mount Sinai, when Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Jewish people, "Mi l'Shem Elai," whoever is for me, come for God, come to me. And your ancestors didn't answer the call because you're not Levium. Everybody else didn't answer. Had your ancestors, you would the Bechor, the firstborn, would have been the Kohanim, and you might be a Kohen today because of that. But because they didn't respond to that call, they got cut out, and Levi became the Kohanim in the end. So he turns to Rav Shimon Schwab and he says, just make sure. Here's your bracha, right? Just make sure the next time that call goes up, Mi l'Shem Elai, make sure you answer it. That was his bracha. He's going to America to start a life over there, right? And this is what he's saying to him. It's going to happen again. He's telling him it's going to happen again. That somehow, in some way, it's going to happen. You're going to be confronted with the same question. Mi l'Shem Elai. Just make sure, A, you hear it, you recognize it, and you answer it the way B'nai Levi did back then. We don't have prophets today, not the ones that you deposit in the bank, but the ones that speak to us on behalf of God. We don't know exactly what God's thinking except through the events of history. And we can delude ourselves 100% and make up things and believe things are the way I am. They're not really, but even that's Hashgacha Pratis too, right? But the bottom line is that call rings out through history. God's been called in the entire time. And what does it mean? What does it mean? Well, who's loyal to him? Who's prepared to get up and leave behind their comfort zone, to go out of their comfort zone, to get out of the box, to do what has to be done in the moment, to prepare the world and make the world a makam of Torah, a place where people recognize the reality of God. Who's prepared to do that on my behalf? Come to me. Because if you don't, you're going to get left behind, big time. Maybe even, God forbid, even from the world altogether. But certainly miss the opportunity of your life. I don't know. I can't say for sure this is what God intended. These codes are authentic, and all this is clearly what it seems to be. I can't say. Certainly is very interesting. But one thing I can say for sure, if this information brings us to the point, the recognition, the realization that this is part of what God's telling us through what's taking place, as of 2000 and 2001, the voice went out, the call has gone up, Mi l'Shem Elai. Then we have to think about that, and we have to take it to heart. And if it means, changing the way we live to do what God wants, that's what we have to be prepared to do, because there is nothing else in the end. We can delude ourselves about that, We can fool ourselves and think that, no, I can get around this and get away from this. I can just avoid the. No. It catches up. One way or another, it catches up. It's interesting. I saw something yesterday, a little pamphlet written just to help people to increase their awareness of redemption and to learn how to anticipate it, because there's a mitzvah to anticipate redemption. And one of the reasons he brought down that people don't is because they don't like change. They don't want change, especially if the situation's good. They're enjoying it. Mashiach would be an inconvenience for them if he were to come, because it's changed. So, it occurred to me as I was walking home looking at this pamphlet that for all we know, that's the reason why, for example, the coronavirus has been sent to us from heaven. It's not random. It doesn't make a difference. The Chinese didn't do it. If this doctor's not, whatever, everyone's just an instrument on behalf of God. But it happened. It's in the world. That's the reality of it. And it's, whatever, that's it. One thing's for sure. It's imposed to change. And though many people are resisting that change, doing everything they can to pretend it's not necessary and not make those changes in the long term. It's changed the world. There's so much change going on that people are complaining about not having really any firm footing these days. Just too much, But that's one of the ways that God prepares us for redemption. It happened in Egypt. It happened in Persia. It happened in Europe all the time. That there will always be events and crises that take place in events of redemption to prepare us to be able to cope with what's coming up. Me, Hashem Elai. That's the call. Think about those words, and work on answering them first to yourself and then to Kosh Baruch Hu, so that when the time really comes clear, you're ready. Shabbat Shalom.
This actually fits very well into a talk that I just heard either yesterday or today about. It was from Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, and he entitled it "Adversity is the Clue to Your Mission." And he explained that the way that one can know what kind of Gilgul, what kind of reincarnation one is that if things come easy to you, then that means that thing that comes easy to you in this world, in this lifetime, has already been perfected in previous lifetimes. If something's difficult, that means that's exactly what you're supposed to be working hard at in order to perfect it. So beautiful.
Yes.
Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for another great Tashir. Again, we recommend that you go to the rabbi's website. It's right above his head, 36.org. And you also go to the YouTube channel, Israel Torah, and you subscribe and press on the notifications to receive notifications of future live webinars like this one. Thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.